Shalom and welcome to the Middle East Report. In this program today we have an inspirational woman who has an incredible story to tell of discovering her Jewish heritage and finding out that her grandfather was a war hero with the Polish army. We'll also be discussing her incredible talents as a photographer and how she's using photography to bless Israel and the Jewish people. Well, welcome to the programme, and today's special guest is all the way from the northeast of Scotland. Her name is Jenny Milne, and she's a photographer and lectures in photography. Jenny, it's such a pleasure to have you on the Middle East Report today. Thank you so much for coming all the way from Scotland to be here today and to tell your remarkable story, but also your remarkable family story and finding out how you've had a very rich Jewish heritage. And you also have an amazing gift of photography that the Lord is using very powerfully to bless Israel and the Jewish people, as you've taken so many photographs of Holocaust survivors and victims of terrorism. So just share with us, for the very start, share something about your background and how you came to faith in Yeshua.
Thank you, Simon, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks very much for inviting me.
It's a pleasure.
I've been a believer since 1984. I grew up in a very troubled home. Actually, my predominant emotion as a child was fear, and fear cancels out every other emotion. My parents had a very unconventional relationship. My mum was a lot younger than my father. My father was born just before the Titanic sank, and my mum was born in 1943. So I have quite a few siblings, and we grew up, I was born in London, but we grew up in a very leafy, quiet village in Padbury in Buckinghamshire. But although everything was really nice on the outside, on the inside, I was terrified, actually, of my mum. And there was a lot of violence, abuse, and emotional abuse. So that was kind of the background that dominated my childhood. Now, my parents split up when I was 10 years old. My father was a musician. He used to play the organ in London, in Trafalgar Square, actually, at lunchtimes. Worked in the city, and he was quite a gentle man. But, you know, the abuse extended towards him as well. So that's why there was a lot of fear. So when my parents split up, I lived with my dad, and I thought it was a lifetime, because when there's an absence of fear, you know, time is extended, I suppose. But it was actually only 3 weeks. And my dad died when he went to play the organ in church on a Sunday night. He died at the organ. I was probably the last person actually to see him, because I helped him put up the hymn numbers. And from there, we left our family home, our childhood home. I slept on my doctor's office that night in between my other 4 siblings. And I just remember thinking that God didn't love me or didn't care about me, because you know, he'd taken my father, who was the only adult in my life that really showed love for me. So it just spiraled down after that. My stepfather was also violent. And so that was the backdrop to my childhood. That was all to change when I turned 16 and we moved. But from the time that my father died, I'd lived in the same home from 7 weeks old to when I was 10. And then we just moved all the time. We lived on a narrowboat, we lived in a council house, we lived in a doomsday boat watermill. We were constantly moving, life was changing. So I was displaced in a lot of ways as well. Lost all my friends and, you know, that history that I'd had until I was 10. So yeah, I was in a bad way by the time I got to 16. But I was watching, my family actually moved. When I was 16, we'd bought, or thought we'd bought, a big thatched cottage in Devon. We moved all our animals because we had a small holding. Arrived there to discover that we hadn't bought it at all. My stepfather hadn't told the truth. And that family, rather than put us out on the street, allowed us to move in. They turned out to be believers. And it was there that I first witnessed, you know, the love of Jesus. Because I'd always gone to church. My mum always sent us to Sunday school, and, you know, I was familiar with, I suppose, the gospel, but I just didn't realize it was personal. And so that couple were called Harry and Ruth Hill King, and it was really through Harry, who was a carpenter, in his workshop amongst all the wood shavings and the smell, you know, of that wood, that I first learnt about Jesus. I, at the same time, watched Jesus of Nazareth, which was on television, a series at the time, with my sister. And I began to be drawn to Jesus. I was an artist, so I had the book, the paperback book with Robert Powell on the front, dressed as Jesus. And I remember drawing him, and I'd listened to Nicodemus quoting Isaiah 53 in that passage where Jesus carries the cross. And that was the first time I opened a Bible. And I went and read Isaiah 53 as I was drawing this picture. I was drawn to Jesus. I couldn't believe that this was explaining, you know, what was to happen thousands of years later to him. And then Harry invited us to go to Billy Graham at Ashton Gate in Bristol. And it was there that I made my first response, because I understood for the first time that God wanted a personal response from me. So I went forward, and then it was about a week later I was delivering some goat's milk. We lived in a town called No Man's Land, or a village. So I always think, well, it was no man's land, it was God's land. And as I was taking this goat's milk, I decided I wanted to know Jesus the way that Harry knew Jesus. I prayed, and I felt my heart was warmed. And I thought that was really strange. And then straight away I thought, no, if God's real, why shouldn't I feel something? And I found myself praying from that point on. So my life totally changed.
Amazing. And then you became a mother, had nine children.
9 children.
And just share with us really what happened when, just about a decade ago, when I think it was at your mother's funeral that the Lord really laid on your heart to find out who you were, who she was, who you are, your family background, which is incredible. I mean, you could do a documentary on what you discovered. So just share with us something about your mother and how really was at her funeral that you really began to understand that she had Jewish roots and connections, and which opened up an incredible story that happened during the Second World War.
Okay, so the defining relationship of my life is probably the relationship with my mum, because when I became a believer, then I wanted to forgive her and move forward. Now, I knew all my childhood that she'd been abandoned as a baby in 1943. She had Polish parents. She didn't really know who she was, and she thought she might be Jewish. So I spent time, you know, trying to build a relationship with my mum, which was quite difficult because she was very closed. But she, in 2013, I asked her if she could tell me everything she knew about her family background. And I wrote it all down. Sadly, she died of cancer just a year later, but I knew I needed to find her family for her. I just stopped when she became ill. So I was at her funeral in Devon, and as I went forward, I touched her coffin, and I realized I'm still looking for that connection. So I just had this sense that I needed to find out who she was. And it was at that point I realized she didn't know who she was either. So I determined that I was going to find my grandparents and why she'd been abandoned. And that led me to discovering that, yes, my grandmother was fully Jewish. She'd escaped from Poland. She came from a place called Stry in Ukraine, which is near Lvov, or Lviv as it is now. It was Poland then. And my grandfather was in the Polish military. So it was through his army records that I was able to find out my grandmother's Jewish name, which was Rothenberg. My grandfather turned out that he was definitely a Polish hero. He'd been nominated for the highest military award twice. He escaped, you know, from the Germans at the beginning of the war, went to France, escaped into Switzerland when France fell, escaped from Switzerland, and managed to come to Scotland where he trained troops. And he was also a part of the Polish government in exile, so he was a very influential figure. My grandmother was much more reticent about her background, but through records discovered by Michael Tobias of originally Jewish Gen, he helped set up Jewish Gen, he was able to write to me and he said, Jenny, you know that you're Jewish. Helena was fully Jewish. And that was, another turning point for me.
So as a believer, What does that mean to you, knowing that you are of Jewish descent and that you've discovered this remarkable story of your family and the incredible exploits that they got up to, both your grandmother and your grandfather during the Second World War?
Yeah, incredible courage that they had. I mean, neither myself or the rest of a large extended family would exist had they not done that. Well, when I found out, when Michael said, you do realise this means that you're Jewish, I knew that it was important, but I didn't know it was going to change my life as much as it has. My brother Peter, he's a pastor, and he said, I wrote to him, I said, Peter, we're Jewish. And he said, well, you can't get more rooted than Abraham. And for my family, my grandmother had multiple identities, changed her name multiple times, so did my mom. I lost my identity when my father died. And suddenly we're rooted, not only by faith, but we're physically rooted to this group of people. And it's been outstanding, discovering my place in the Jewish community.
And Jenny, just explain to us the lengths that you went to, and also tell us how the Lord helped you to uncover your grandparents' incredible story and finding out about your Jewish heritage, because the amount of investigative journalism effectively that you had to do to find your Jewish roots, to find your family history and your family tree, it's just extraordinary.
Yeah, once I have decided I'm going to do something, I don't really give up. I remember coming back from Devon all the way up to Scotland thinking I've got to find out who my grandparents were. And the first thing I did, I woke up one morning and I just knew I had to do it. I felt God wanted me to do it, and I prayed. Because in Daniel it says, there's a God in heaven who can reveal secrets. And also a lovely verse that I like from Proverbs, it says, it's the glory of God to conceal a matter, but it's the honor of kings to search it out. And I decided I was going to search this matter out. So I took the few notes that my mum had given me. She had met both her parents briefly in the early 60s in London, lost contact again. I took those. I realized that there was nothing to go, to find my grandmother to go on. Her name, Helena Lees, my grandfather's name was Stanisław Lees. I knew wouldn't help me. But so I got in touch with the Polish Ex-Combatants Association because I knew my grandfather had been the international secretary. Got on the phone a Polish lady who'd been there since the 50s, and she said to me, Jenny, I know who your grandfather was. And she said, it's unbelievable to talk to the granddaughter of somebody so famous. And that was my first inclination that my grandfather, had real presence in the Polish emigre. She pointed me towards the Ministry of Defense, the Polish section. They would have my grandparents' records, and my grandfather's records. So they found them within 15 minutes. Yes, we have your grandfather's records. He was buried in Gunnersbury Cemetery in London. He came from Lvov. So straight away I had more information than we'd had all our lives. And then I thought, they must have my grandmother's records as well, because when she'd met my mum, she said that she was in the Polish army and she was just desperate when she was going to give birth to Mum, her only child. She hid her, actually. Michael Tobias said to me, she was the only Jewish baby they believe hidden in the UK. They've found Jewish babies hidden all over Europe. But she was the first baby that's been discovered to have been hidden in the United Kingdom. So it was, then I phoned them back, do you have records for Helena Lees? Yes, we have one record. They corroborated with my grandfather's records. Yes, it was her. And that really is what helped, that unlocked the door to find the records that Michael found. So he found she was registered under another name, Malia Rothenberg. She changed her age, but we realized by her date of birth that yes, this was her. And she had a sister, so I ultimately was able to trace her sister's family in the States as well. So it's been fantastic, incredible journey. But I didn't give up, that was mostly it.
Amazing. Also share with us some of the more of the darker history to your family story, that many of your family members that you've just found out that are your family were actually murdered in the Holocaust.
Yeah. So from my mum's notes that she gave me, her mother had told her she had a brother who was murdered by the Germans. So I kind of had known that as a child. But interestingly, Helena's sister, Irena, never told her family that. But as I began to, trace more and more of the family, Michael helped me to build an initial tree, and then I began to just build my own tree through records, Jewish index registering in Poland and Jewish Gen. I discovered that, most of my grandmother's cousins had been murdered in the Holocaust. And actually, just recently, just 3 weeks ago, I discovered that her father, who we've been looking for, I've got people all over the world that have been looking for him, Pinchas Rothenberg, his name was. I found out the night before we went to Israel that actually I found him on Yad Vashem. So he was murdered as well. So that was the closest family member that I have records for, is my great-grandfather and his wife. Yeah, it was very sobering. I began to read as much as I could about the communities that I knew they belonged to. That was very overwhelming. I read the Yizkor pages for Stri, which is the Jewish record of the community that was completely destroyed. I'm not sure how many survivors there were from Stri, but there were under 100 from 12,000. And it starts with a passage from Lamentations. And absolute devastation. And that made me think, okay, so what about the people that survived? What's happened to the Jewish community today? Are they safe? Because up until that point, I'd assumed that yes, they were.
And also share with us how on the course of your extraordinary journey of investigation, Jenny, that you've been able to build strong friendships and ties with members of the Jewish community that have actually helped you discover your Jewish family roots. Yeah,
well, the first person was Michael Tobias. I met him and his wife in Glasgow, actually on my birthday that first year, 2014. And I'd never really remember meeting a Jewish person before. So I became good friends with them. And then a journalist, a Jewish journalist, I'd actually liked his page on Facebook. It was called Seeking Kin when I was searching. And he phoned me and said, "Who are you looking for?" I said, "I'm looking for my grandmother and her family." And so he wrote an article that went into the Times of Israel. His name is Hillel Cutler, and it was really through him that I became engaged with the Jewish community, because he encouraged me to connect with the Jewish community in Aberdeen. So the first service I went to was Yom Kippur in 2015. And I just continued to do as much as I could then to engage with the community. I covered a Taste of Israel, which was in Aberdeen. It was a night celebrating Israel that had been organized there. And and it's just built from that point.
Amazing. What lessons, reflecting back on your incredible journey of investigating your Jewish family background, what would you say the kind of lessons that you've learned from that, and what has it taught you?
Oh, well, that I didn't know as much as I thought I did, I think as a believer, we sometimes have things in boxes. We think we know, okay, this is what God's going to do, this is what he's done, and we've got it all right. And I think I realized that actually, rather than being the center, the church being the center, we've been invited in to grafted into the olive tree. And so my theology hasn't changed in terms of salvation, but everything else kind of has changed, because I realized that God has a plan and a purpose for his people that he has never, given up, and that he loves the Jewish people. And so that has been a major change. And another change has been that I realized that anti-Semitism is alive and well. I've experienced it myself online, when I've posted things. And I've seen my friends have experienced anti-Semitism. I see the fear in the Jewish community. So a lot of things have changed, but it's absolutely enriched my life beyond anything that I could describe.
I can imagine. And do you look at your grandmother and your mother differently now that you're able to piece all of the jigsaw together, and you've got a complete map of your whole Jewish ancestry?
Absolutely, because I spent my life, trying to process the trauma that I'd had that was really as a result of my relationship with my mom. When you join the Jewish community, you realize, that's nothing compared to that trauma. But I've been able to understand my mom a lot better. I mean, my one sadness, I suppose, is she doesn't know what I found out. It would have changed her life to know she had family, for example. So I've been able to forgive her as well, posthumously. I mean, I always tried to walk in forgiveness towards her, but it's definitely changed the way that I see my mum. And my grandmother, I just have admiration for. She was her only baby, her only child. She gave her up, you know, to continue fighting for her family who were being destroyed in Poland. And she never had the opportunity to raise her daughter. So yeah, it's changed the way I see them a lot.
Amazing. What advice would you have for anyone wanting to embark on this incredible journey of discovering their own genealogy, their family history, and discovering what kind of secrets might be revealed through the research like you've done?
I think, you know, if you have trauma or you have something in your family, or even if you don't, I didn't realise that finding my family would fill in a blank or lots of blanks that I didn't know were there. I didn't know that it would enrich my sense of identity and heritage, show me, you know, I stand on the shoulders of some really incredible people, you know, but it also healed a lot of the pain in my family and the pain in myself. So yeah, if you want to research your family, there's lots of good places to start. If you know that you have Jewish roots or suspect you have Jewish roots, you can look at Jewish Gen online. Jewish Research Indexing Poland in particular is what I looked at. Just start digging, you know, talk to relatives, you know, the oldest people in your family, ask them questions, those kind of things.
Excellent. But you also have an incredible gift of photography, so you actually lecture in photography. But share with us how the Lord opened this door for you as well, because all these things happened almost at the same time, didn't they?
They definitely did, yeah. So in 2014, when my mum died, I'd been at home for 27 years raising our children. I didn't have any qualifications. I'd kind of run away from home when I was younger, left school when I was 15. And so I was praying and asking the Lord to show me what I should do, you know, moving on, because my youngest son was getting older. And I thought about what's in your hand. Well, I always had a camera in my hands, you know, took photos of my own children and other people's children. I was always documenting things. My father was a photographer, an amateur photographer, but a very good photographer. So it was a connection with him. And then as time went on, so I went to college to study, and I got an HND, and then I went on to university, and I realized that I could actually create projects which would be meaningful, telling other people's stories through using the camera, which was a means of connection and an opportunity, an invitation to discuss, you know, what people had experienced in their lives. So it was really, you know, several things. You know, photographers are storytellers. And so I worked on my photography skills so that I could tell other people's stories and give them a voice.
Amazing. And share with us what your first trip to Israel was like.
The first trip to Israel was quite interesting. So I'd wanted to plan it. It was going to be this really special occasion, you know, I was going to go and kiss the ground. And actually I came home from work one day and Brian said it was due to be our anniversary, and he's like, Jen, do you want to go to Israel? And I'm like, well, it's only 3 or 4 days away. And it wasn't what I was planning. And he's like, well, it's either football or a football match. And no, it's either Israel or a football match. So I said Israel. So the first time we went to Israel, we met up with a lady who I'd been in touch with as a result of wanting to help victims of terrorism. Her name is Tammy Wise. She had the same number of children as us, 9 children. And she invited us to her home. She lives in a place called Neria. And she gave us a meal, and it's the start of a wonderful friendship. And really, she has helped me in all the work that I've done. So yes, it was very special. Since then, we've just kept going back.
Amazing. And just also share with us your interest in capturing photographs of Holocaust survivors, and why for you is that important to make the Holocaust essentially personal. You see personal faces and personal expressions in those photographs, but of course those people are kind of haunted by their horrific memories. Yeah,
totally. Well, for me, I realized it once it was personal for me, how important it was. So I wanted to make it personal for other people. Now, everybody I've photographed, I've made a connection with. And the Holocaust survivors I photographed, I was able to connect with them through a cousin I'd matched in DNA. Turned out to be my Mum's second cousin, their grandfathers were brothers. He lives in America, his name's Alan Rothenberg, and he gave me names of family in London, and it was them that I went and photographed, Adam and Elisa Malamed, or Adam Adams he called himself. So meeting them, they were both sole survivors. Alicia came from Drohobych, which is where my family came from. We're connected by family. Adam came from Lublin, and they lost everybody. And so when I went to meet them, Adam was amazing, tiny little man, you know, with a very strong Polish accent, more concerned about my camera. But, you know, he talked to me about his experience of being hidden in the ground for 8 months in a hole. I think it was 6 foot by 6 foot with his friend in total darkness. That's how he survived. And the only time he became emotional was when he told me he had no photographs of his family, and he tried to remember what his sisters looked like at night, and he couldn't. That had a very powerful impact on me. And his wife lost everybody as well. She took me through her photograph album one by one. This one was murdered by the Germans. This was my beautiful brother. He was murdered by the Germans. It left a profound impact on me. And when I came away, I realized this was living memory. This was their memory. You know, they'd lived all their lives carrying this, and they'd gone on and had very fruitful lives, but the pain was definitely still there. And I thought, I have to tell their stories. Elie Wiesel said, to listen to a witness is to become a witness. And I determined that every time I spoke, I would tell their stories. I think it's very, very important that we, you know, when people look at a photograph, it begins a conversation. You know, who is this person? Can I, you know, I want to create that connection.
Amazing. And you've also had a couple of exhibitions, haven't you, of your incredible photographs. One I know that was in Aberdeen, but the other one was not too far from here in Wimbledon, at the Reform Synagogue in Wimbledon. Just share with us about your photographs and the reaction of those who have actually seen them.
Well, when I first took them, I wanted to, you know, I thought I was a photojournalist and I was going to show something dramatic. It ended up with every person I've met, I sat down, had a cup of tea, and then took an image that reflected that conversation. And I realized that's what I want. I want people to look into their faces and realize these people are just like me and you. And, you know, their stories are incredible. The victims of terrorism that I've met and become very good friends with. Incredible people, and I wanted other people to look at them and think, I want to know more about them. So yes, I had quite a few exhibitions, including Roehampton University actually, and I've been up to Shetland, different places.
Excellent. And what was the response of these photographs? I'm sure they went down very well in the Reform Synagogue in Wimbledon, because our mutual friend Stephen Jaffe told me about you back in, I think, 2019, but for some reason we didn't connect, and a few years later you're here now, so and you're telling me and our viewers as well your incredible story.
Well, I think that the photographs, and I always speak, you know, at the opening of an exhibition as well. People in this country, even in the Jewish community, weren't particularly aware, I think, sometimes, or didn't want to talk about the victims of terrorism in Israel. And I think it opened people's hearts, you know, to embrace people and realize that, yeah, we need to stand with people in Israel. We need to support them. And these people have something incredible. They have incredible stories, incredible resilience, but we need to stand with them. We need to support them.
Absolutely. So we just saw a photograph just a minute there of Kay Wilson, who I must have interviewed on the Middle East Report over a decade ago, must have been about 2013, and a very close friend who was murdered in a forest, I think, just outside of Jerusalem while they were hiking. How important is it, do you think? I mean, a lot of focus is focused on Holocaust survivors, and rightly so, because literally it was hell on earth and what they went through to tell their stories. But also it seems that the victims of terrorism, particularly in Israel, are largely forgotten. that
Yes.
no one seems to take that much interest in them, considering that they are going through trauma. I mean, one of my friends was murdered in a Palestinian terrorist attack back in 2002 at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. So I know the feeling is kind of very real when you know people that have been murdered in terrorist attacks, and there's been so many terrorist attacks in Israel over the decades. Share what it's like when you take their photographs and they want to share their story with you.
Yeah, it was difficult to start with. The first person I photographed was a man called Steve Bloomberg, who comes from London. He's in a wheelchair. His wife was shot dead next to him when he was taking his children home from choosing some items for school, his pregnant wife. He put me at ease straight away. So he was paralyzed in that attack. And I don't know, it can be overwhelming, but I realised, their voices need to be heard. People need to know. The one thing we were told the first time we went to Israel is there's no shortage of terror victims in Israel. There are thousands and thousands of people that have been impacted by terrorism, have family members that have been murdered, children. So I think to start with it was very difficult, but I realised their stories were more important. So I tried to put them at ease, and it's a responsibility to have somebody's story that you're sharing.
Amazing. And Jenny, you have recently been to Israel, and you met that incredible man called Rabbi D, who around a year ago, his wife and two of his teenage daughters were murdered while they were driving, I think, in the Jordan Valley, in an absolutely horrific terrorism shooting. Share what it's like to actually meet him and for him to tell his story to you.
It was an honour to meet him, to start with. I knew as soon as the attack happened, we were just back from Israel actually last year, not long before this attack happened. I knew I wanted to speak to him in the future. And it was just happened that it worked out this time. He's an absolute gentleman, but the pain that he carries, nobody could imagine, I would say. Because he's British, actually there has been a little bit of attention on his story in the UK press, but he was remarkably composed and told us, his wife and daughter, they were on their way to Tiberias for a holiday, and they were basically driven off the road, his wife and two daughters, and assassinated, really. I think that's how you would say it. And he found out through telegram when he saw that the car was his wife's car, and turned back. The police wouldn't let him near. And he's had to pick up the pieces with his other children and keep living. And he told us that, there was World I with his wife and daughters, and now they're living in World II. And he said then October the 7th, which was 6 months after, I think, he said now we're in World III. And it was amazing to meet him. We had our friend Steve there as well, whose circumstances were so similar in 2001. And after I finished speaking to him, he shared his own story, and I don't think there were any of us sitting there, and there was only a few of us that weren't moved to tears by that conversation.
So let's remind ourselves of what happened to Rabbi D's lovely wife and two teenage daughters as they were murdered in cold blood by a Palestinian terrorist.
As Rabbi Leo D, the husband and father of 3 terror victims, grieved the loss of his wife, he also chose to be thankful.
On Sunday, I talked about looking at the good. Lucy, I have a choice. I could lament over the next 25 years of marriage that I've lost, but I actually feel blessed to have had 25 years of a beautiful marriage with you.
Tragedy struck when terrorists fired on a car carrying Lucy D and their daughters, Maya and Kareen, as they headed to a family vacation. Maya and Kareen died immediately, while Lucy lived 3 more days.
Lucy had had 2 bullets, one through her brainstem and one lodged at the top of her spine. There was operation, there was reason for hope, but alas, our family of 7 is now a family of 4.
Rabbi D praised his wife at her funeral.
Your light has traveled across all of humanity in an instant. You held on so we could honor you individually and give you a unique send-off for a unique soul. a soul that has changed and will continue to change so many lives. May your soul be so bound up in the bond of everlasting life.
As a final tribute, the rabbi donated Lucy's organs to save the lives of others. Doctors transplanted her heart, liver, and kidneys to 4 patients in need. Bellinson Hospital CEO Dr. Eitan Wertheim called organ donation the ultimate gift of life for the recipients. Our hearts break for the D family, who suffered an unimaginable loss, and yet, during their darkest hour, they thought about how Lucy could continue to help others by donating her organs so that these individuals can have a renewed sense of life. The D family immigrated here from the UK in 2014. Rabbi D now sees a greater need to remain and calls on Israelis to unite and the world to support Israel.
If we support the good and reject the evil, then we can all play our part in building a better world.
And he asked everyone to take a symbolic stand.
So make today D's Day. Just share a post with an Israeli flag and let the message out. If we differentiate between good and evil, then we can all help make this world a better place. Do it for your soul. Do it for the souls of Maya, Rena, and Lucy D. Do it for all of humanity. And do it now. It has never been more urgent.
Israeli security forces remain on high alert against the possibility of more attacks, and Prime Minister Netanyahu has vowed to find the terrorists and hold them accountable. Julie Stahl, CBN News, Jerusalem.
And I'm sure many of you will be very much aware of that news story that occurred almost a year ago, around a year ago during Passover of last year, which made headlines around the world. Jenny, you actually met up with Rabbi Leo D in Jerusalem. Just share with us what he was going through and why he wanted to tell his story, particularly in light of the horrors that occurred since October the 7th.
Yeah, so I reached out to him last year actually, and he would have met with us, or maybe earlier in this year. He told me after this interview that I had with him, where he did have to compose himself at one point because it was so difficult for him to talk about his wife and 2 daughters, that he actually thanked me because he said it was therapeutic. It helped him to talk. I think he's driven by the need, to make sense and bring something good from his horrific, terrible loss. And I found that along with other survivors of terrorism or people that have lost family. Arnold Roth would be one of those. I connected with him. He actually was originally Rothenberg, and so he seemed like a family member. But when his 15-year-old daughter was murdered, Malki, in 2001 in the Sbarro pizza bombing, he sat down with his family and decided that they would create something in Malki's memory that would support and help disabled children throughout the land of Israel, because their youngest daughter is severely disabled, and Malki loved disabled children. And so he did something very positive and created the Malki Foundation. And I think, Rabbi Leo D and other people that I've met have this incredible response to what's happened to them. We can't imagine it. I cannot imagine what he is going through. And his pain, I think, was evident to everybody. But you just have to be sensitive to that and allow him to talk and tell his story in his words. And then be faithful and honest in the way that you then retell his story. And that's what I try and do.
Excellent. So thanks to Jenny, we have a little extract of her interview with Rabbi Leo D, talking about the loss of his wife, Lucy, and his 2 daughters, which made the headlines around April of 2023.
So we were traveling on our Pesach holiday with the second day of Passover, 2023, April the 7th, Friday. We left in the morning in 2 cars, my wife with Maya and Rena. Maya's 20, Rena 15. I was with my son Yehuda and daughter Tali, and we have a 5th daughter who was in Jerusalem for the weekend. We drove following ways up the Route 90, through the Jordan Valley. Ways directed us both on a sort of longer route around to bypass the top part of the 90. I changed the route to continue straight because I had Lucy's voice ringing in my ears. She'd always tell me to continue straight. It was the easiest, and even if it took a bit longer. And I assumed she would do the same. She didn't do the same. She took a left. And about half an hour later, I got a telephone call from my sister, who is in a car about an hour behind us. And she said, we've heard that there's been a terror attack on the road. Are you okay? So I said, I'm okay. So I immediately called Lucy, no answer. I called Maya, no answer. I called Rena, no answer. Then I checked Google Family Link and I saw that they were at the Hamra Junction, which was where we'd heard the terrorist attack had been. So we turned around immediately. As I was on the route, my son, through Telegram, saw a site where they post pictures of the terror attacks, and there was a photograph of the car, which was our car with our beach bags splattered in blood on the back of the seat. So we knew the worst had happened, so we drove down there. I desperately wanted to identify that it was them. The police wouldn't let me anywhere near it, so we sat for about an hour in an ambulance. At the end of an hour, I said, we've got some proof, because I knew that the mother had been airlifted to Ein Kerem Hospital for operations, and I thought we might have to be there. And eventually they brought me the ID card from Maya. So we knew the worst, and I immediately set off down to Jerusalem. We spent the night, I spent the next 3 or 4 days in the hospital in Ein Kerem. Lucy had an operation to remove 2 bullets, one from her brainstem, one from her spine. Unfortunately, it didn't succeed, and we buried my 2 daughters on the Sunday and my wife on the Tuesday. So, yeah, I mean, how have we coped? What's helped us? Many things have helped us. Number one, from the moment this happened, we felt a very warm hug from the whole Jewish people, not just in Israel, but all over the world. And we got literally thousands, maybe tens of thousands of messages from people, Jews and non-Jews actually. It really was incredible. Strange enough, I met somebody else you should speak to called Avida Bechar, who's a survivor from Barrett, who lost his wife and 15-year-old son hiding in the safe room in their house under attack for 12 hours by terrorists. And he lost a leg as well. But I met him in his hotel in the Dead Sea about a month after the tragedy, and I couldn't understand how he was coping with it so well until that evening I went with him to the hall of the hotel. They had a meeting for 1,000 members of the kibbutz Barrett in that hall, and I saw them all together. And I realized that for him, he hadn't lost 2 members of a family of 6, but actually 2 members of a family of 1,000.
Yeah.
And then I realized that I hadn't lost 3 members of a family of 7, but really 3 members of a family of 14 million. And the fact that everybody had sort of come around and been involved really was one of the most amazing things. The second thing, at the end of the 30 days of mourning, I turned to my kids and I said, we're starting a new world. I said, we were in world number 1 with 2 parents and 5 kids. We're now entering world number 2 with 1 parent and 3 kids. So we've had 30 days of pain and crying and suffering in between, but we have to start afresh, and it's going to be a good world, it's going to be a happy world, but a world with memories of world number 1, but completely different, and everything starts from now.
Well, that was very moving, and we need to really keep Rabbi Leo D and his family very much in our prayers, and you can see the trauma that's still affecting him. Of course it would, and I can't comprehend what he actually went through, and the way that he's dealt with this is just an inspiration to us all, and then having to deal with the horrors of October the 7th on top of that as well. So please do keep him in our prayers, and if you want to see the rest of that interview, just look up the interview with Rabbi Leo D and put Jenny's name in. Jenny, thank you for doing that interview, and it's incredible for him to tell his story. Sadly, we didn't have time to show the whole 22 minutes of the interview that you did with him, but you did very well in filming that. But share with us what your experience of visiting Israel post October the 7th was like, and how it would have been very different from last year.
Yes, it was certainly very different. So Brian and I both went just on the day after Boxing Day, I think, we went to Israel. And it was strange because nobody was there other than Israelis, which, you know, Israel's usually full and bustling with, you know, lots of different visitors. Everywhere you went, there were posters, bring them home now. We went to Hostage Square, which was very confronting as well.
In Tel Aviv.
In Tel Aviv, yeah. And you just saw these pictures everywhere. We also had the opportunity of meeting some of the families of the hostages. Rabbi Barrett was his son Daniel was captured. At the time he believed that he was alive and they were waiting. Now that was a very different experience than interviewing victims of terrorism where the event is in the past and it's extremely traumatic. But for Rabbi Doron, his son was missing, and that was incredibly moving, spending time with him. He has later been found just fairly recently to have been murdered on October the 7th. So I think they've found footage to show that Daniel lost his life then. We also met with the grandparents of a hostage, current hostage, Alon Ohel, and that was again extremely difficult. You're walking into a home where his picture is there in his grandparents' home, you know, sitting on a chair, and they're desperate to bring him home and very frightened about saying anything that might harm him or cause him trouble. So yeah, it was a very different visit, and we went back again just a few weeks ago. Now what I noticed as a photographer, these posters are all faded and scratched, and you know, you think the length of time they're fading from people's minds, the hostages are fading. You know, it was kind of symbolic of that to me, and we must keep them. You know, we must be aware that these people are still missing, these families are still torn apart. And there was also tension because of what Iran was just about to do. Actually, we just left the country almost right before Iran made its strike on Israel. But we were up north, and there was definitely tension. We were with Tal Hartouv, who was formerly Kay Wilson. She now is Tal Hartouv. And she said to us that when we arrived, you know, this could happen while you're here. But we did go bird watching with her, you know, so life goes on in Israel.
Oh, it certainly does, and there's no one better than that than the Israelis. But share with us kind of your thoughts on Israel post October the 7th, because I mean you've taken pictures of Holocaust survivors, and I think the only comparison you can make of what happened on October the 7th was the Holocaust, primarily because this was the largest number of Jewish people who were massacred at the hands of Hamas than we've seen since the Holocaust over 80 years ago. The only difference is the Israelis thought that they were actually safe and didn't think that Hamas could penetrate the Eretz crossing, the border crossing between Gaza and Israel. And of course, when I went back in the end of January and February and saw kibbutz Nir Oz and saw the destruction caused by Hamas on that day, the one thing you come away with is the sheer magnitude of what happened that is not portrayed in our mainstream media reports of what happened. No,
I think, you know, genocide is what happened. The difference is maybe on the scale, but not on the motivation, because Hamas has stated their stated aim is to kill the Jews wherever they are. So that's no different to the Nazi goal, as far as I can see. And what they did was absolutely barbaric in every sense. So the main thing that I've noticed with the media is the reporting, the denial, the, you know, apportioning blame wrongly a lot of the time. And these are things that we have to fight. I think in the church, I would like to see the church actually stand up for Israel and become engaged. We speak about Israel and the Jewish people every Sunday morning. Some churches are very good at supporting Israel. Other believers, like I was a number of years ago, don't think it's relevant. But I think we must stand behind Israel. We must support the Jewish people. And now more than ever, anti-Semitism, we see it on the college campuses in America, and it's frightening to see the levels of anti-Semitism and know this is where things started, you know, in the past.
Absolutely. So do you have any plans to go back to Israel and to take photographs of the survivors of October the 7th and for them to tell their horrific and traumatic story, but also the families of those who have had loved ones kidnapped by Hamas? And I mean, reports now, we don't know what's happened to the 130
No.
that are still being held
That's right.
by Hamas. And we can see here, this is in Tel Aviv, the main Rabin Square, isn't it? And this is remembering the hostages and to bring them home.
Yeah, this was our first visit after Christmas. We went straight to the hostage square and took these pictures there.
You know, unfortunately, the news story moves on so quickly.
That's right.
And we've got to a stage now, for example, where the world was in shock and horror at what happened to Israel on October the 7th. And then with Israel's military incursion into Gaza to destroy Hamas, the perpetrators of the most horrific crimes against the Jewish people we've seen since the Holocaust. Of course, the narrative changes, and now it's all about Israel's destruction of Gaza. But the reality is that Israel has to destroy Hamas, and for the sake of the people and the residents of Gaza, they need to be liberated, not from Israel, but from Hamas.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that people have a responsibility to educate themselves, turn off the news and go and actually, you know, find out through other sources, not just the main news in this country, what's really happening. And in terms of going back, yes, I would love to go back, and I would go back and back and back if I could, and tell stories.
And Jenny, if we do a complete full circle of your story, finding out that you had Jewish ancestry, finding out that your grandparents have got an incredible story to tell of heroics during the Second World War, and then also then linking up with your photographs of Holocaust survivors and the photographs of Israeli victims of terrorism and what you've seen post October the 7th, has it given you a deeper understanding of maybe the Jewish heart, the Jewish psyche, or the dark, what's the best way to describe this? The dark cloud that still lingers over the Jewish people after the Holocaust. And of course, the Israelis and the Jewish community have a new dark cloud over them, which is October the 7th.
Yeah, I think two things. When I found out that I was Jewish, I thought it was important to me, but I very quickly realized the reason I knew was because it was important to God.
Amen.
He wanted me to know, you know, and he wanted us to come alongside the Jewish people. And I've learned, you know, I've discovered a people that I can connect with, identify with, that are incredibly resilient, but they've gone through so much. It just never stops. It's relentless. There's always something, you know, someone that's wanting to blame them or harm them. So I think definitely we have a responsibility, especially as believers, you know, to really pray for them, support them in every way that we can, because they're God's people at the end of the day.
Amen. And just share with us how you've done that through the kind of artistic prism of photographs. I mean, you've just given me this kind of amazing book here. Look, we can see it here, and I can just open some of the pictures of some of the people that Jenny has interviewed. I'm trying to get a picture of her face.
Yeah, a picture of her.
There we go. I mean, like, you know, I reached out there, I think, to the Orthodox community in Israel, particularly the Jewish settlers living in the biblical heartland of Israel, Judea and Samaria. And how important is it to tell Israel's story through the lens of a camera?
I think it's very important. I think the camera is a tool. I mean, I love photography, you know, and we read images in the way we read books, especially with my students. So I think, you know, it's a visual language. It's a way of communicating almost without words, but it draws people in. It can empower people, it gives them a voice. These people, many of these people, some are well known, you know, because their stories were spread far and wide. Racheli Frankel would be one of those whose son Naftali was kidnapped by Hamas and found to be murdered in 2014. Her story was told around the world, but many of them have not been told around the world. And I think it's very, very important that they're given a voice, because their response to what's happened to them is outstanding in many ways, I think. But photography, yes, it's a language. It's important to speak. And I'd like to finish with the words of Esther. You know, when I was seeking the Lord not long before my mum died, when I was trying to process the trauma that I'd gone through as a child, I felt the Lord told me to read Esther. And it said, if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from somewhere else, and you and your household will perish. As a result of that, I actually fasted for 3 days. I knew that we're connected with my mom. And so my camera is also a way of not remaining silent at this time.
Amazing. What message would you have for our viewers regarding your story and the importance of telling Israel's story, telling the Jewish story to a Christian audience that should, if they read their Bibles, know that God has a plan of salvation. He has an incredible plan of blessing for Israel and the Jewish people.
Yeah, God hasn't finished with the Jewish people. That's very clear from reading the book of Romans. But you have to take the whole Bible into context and the promises that God made to Israel. He said he wouldn't go back on them. You know, as long as the sun and moon stayed in the sky, you know, his word, his promise was towards Israel, and that hasn't changed. Nothing in Scripture's changed that. I think as believers it should encourage us that God keeps his word, and when he makes a covenant with us, he keeps that covenant. So from my own perspective, God uses connection. He found a connection for me to become engaged. That connection happened to be my own family history. But for all of us, God will connect us with what he has for us in different ways if we just seek him and keep an open heart.
Amen. Jenny, I just want to thank you so much for being my special guest on the Middle East Report today. Thank you so much for telling your remarkable story. And I've been blessed, and I'm sure our viewers have been as well. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
And I just want to thank you for watching today's Middle East Report. It's extraordinary. If we just look and dig into our family history, what we can discover and what God can show us, and particularly in Jenny's case, showing her Jewish heritage and how understanding her Jewish heritage has meant that she can make a huge difference by telling the stories of Holocaust survivors as well as victims of terrorism in Israel. So I want to thank you for watching today's edition of the Middle East Report.